Good afternoon and welcome to the Gibson Grove Gone But Not Forgotten presentation by Dr. Alexandra Jones. As Allison said, my name is Don Housley, President of the Mid-Potomac chapter of the Archaeological Society of Maryland, the sponsor for this presentation. Since the first history conference in 2007, there has been an archaeology speaker sponsored by our chapter due to Montgomery Park's archaeologist Heather Boslog, who serves on the conference's planning committee. Thanks to Heather for reaching out to Dr. Jones and to Dr. Jones for accepting the invitation to speak today. Dr. Jones is the founder and chief executive officer of Archaeology in the Community based in Washington, D.C. Beginning in 2006, this nonprofit organization's mission has been to study and promote a community's archaeological heritage by reaching out to its members, especially its youth. Dr. Jones received her bachelor's and master's degree in history and anthropology from Howard University and a PhD in historical archaeology from the University of California at Berkeley. Her doctoral dissertation focused on the largely, until now, silenced Gibson Grove African-American community in Cabin John. Archaeology is based on the idea that communities leave behind markers of their cultural identity, whether these markers are in the ground or still visible on the landscape, or in old shoe boxes in someone's attic, in tattered and dusty documents, or in oral history of descendant community members. The nature of historical archaeology is to search for and use all these markers to provide a complete history of a community, especially one like Gibson Grove. In these times of seeking racial justice, Gibson Grove offers vital lessons in persistence, resilience, and pride. To tell the past and present story of Gibson Grove's cultural markers, please welcome Dr. Alexandra Jones.
Thank you, Don and Allison, for that. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'll share my screen with everyone. So silence broken, Gibson Grove gone but not forgotten, a community's fight to save its sacred space. History is flawed in its portrayal of the past. This is especially true for marginalized groups, such as including but not limited to women, children, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Oftentimes, marginalized groups are completely omitted from the history they helped create. As archaeologists, it's imperative we share our data with the community so everyone can gain insight from our findings. Keeping in mind Maria Franklin's assertion that most of us have not given Black society much reason to feel that archaeology should be important to them. Archaeological data is essential to African American history, and as scholars with such sites, we need to share the value of our work. There are responsibilities that come with understanding the importance of material culture studies and how they help fill in the gaps of the written record. As archaeologists, we have the power to not just write history, but to create works of social action. Those of us engaged in making history, especially of marginalized groups who have limited visibility in the documentary record, need to reflect critically on our role in constructing history and on the power that history has in its presence. And it is this that is central to my actual talk today. The power that you have in constructing history and how it then helps create social justice in the present. 12 years ago, I gave a talk on Gibson Grove, and in that talk, I stated, Reflecting on what my work could lend to the history of Cabin John and African American history as a whole, I was determined to make sure the history of Gibson Grove was preserved. As a result of my work, all of the ethnographic interviews conducted with the older living members of Cabin John's African American community have been housed in the Montgomery County Historical Society Library. The histories of Cabin John's African American community, along with the story of Gibson Grove AME Zion Church and Morning Star Tabernacle number 88 Order of Moses, have all gained a place in Cabin John's history. So, why am I back 12 years later, you may be wondering? The short answer to this is the expansion of I-495. But more than that, I believe in using my skills as an archaeologist for social justice, redress, and I deeply respect the community that gave so much to me. The first African American to purchase land near Gibson Grove was Peter Jones, who in 1870 bought 3 acres of land along the middle of Alms House Road. Later in 1880, Robert Gibson purchased 3 acres of Carter Rock from Thomas and Amanda Dowling, almost midway on what is now Seven Locks Road. J.D.W. Moore purchased 93 acres in Carter Rock's tract in 1884, and soon after, he started selling off small plots of land to the following Black families. If you look at the map, you'll actually see the names of the families. So Peter Holmes and James Coates purchased land in 1885. Henry Carter and Phillips Jackson, Lloyd Jackson, George Scott, Daniel and Maria Gray, and Charles Brown all purchased in 1885. Peter Jones purchased land in 1887, having moved from originally where he was at the Alms House property that he had purchased in 1870. And then George Fry in 1887 also purchased land in what will become Gibson Grove. It is believed many of these family members were enslaved or worked for the Moore family. And in the early part of the 20th century, the original stretch of homes was called Number 10 Road because of the 10 houses of Gibson Grove residents. Later, we see Robert and Emma Jones join Gibson Grove in 1897. Their home was described by descendants as one of the prettiest houses for miles to see. Robert and Emma worked in DC for who we know as Clara Barton, who founded the American Cross. Later on, when the American Cross moved to Glen Echo, various Gibson Grove residents are noted as working for the American Cross. Robert Jones was a general groundskeeper and handyman. Francis Walker was a caretaker of the property. Silas Richards was a manager of stock and a groundskeeper, and his wife would sometimes also do housekeeping. Charles Jones, the grandson, of George Scott, also worked as a groundskeeper, while Daisy and Odella Jones came in and helped with the kitchen and housework. So as we think about this community, we've already established that we see a number of people living along what will become Seven Locks Road. So this was just the beginning. We go into community building because it's one thing to live in a community, but it's another to make it your home. So the earliest school for Cabin John's Black community was called Morris School, and it consisted of a single room that was 16 by 24 feet on Conroy Road. This later becoming a portion of what would be Seven Locks, located between River and Conduit roads. Robert and Sarah Gibson sold in 1881 land specifically to erect a house thereupon as a schoolhouse and a house of worship for the use of colored people of this community. The next year, the school board purchased land for $32.83. The original building was a simple log building with logs harvested from the Gibson property. And the first teacher is recorded as being Edward Gant, and he started in 1889. In 1898, Sarah Gibson transferred land to the church trustees for the use of Gibson Grove AME Zion Church. That said premises shall be used and kept, maintained, and disposed of as a place of divine worship for the use of the ministry and membership of the African Methodist Zion Church in America. And the deed noted that the land adjoins the colored school house known as number 10. The early church was a log cabin built south of the current site. Congregants used the waters of the nearby Cabin John Creek for baptism in warm weather, and in the winter used a small creek on Gibson land. The church not only hosted religious services and occasional encampments, but in traditional Black communities, what you also saw was that the church house was also a place where political meetings and decisions were also made. So here is a picture of the Gibson Grove church members on top of the steps right at the front of the church. And this is a modern day image. Members of the community started a lodge of the Ancient United Orders of Sons and Daughters, Brothers and Sisters of Moses, around about 1885. The Gibson Grove location, known as the Moses Hall and the Moses Cemetery, belonged to the Morning Star Tabernacle number 88 of the Ancient United Order of Sons and Daughters, Brothers and Sisters of Moses. The hall and the cemetery were built on 1 acre of land, formerly conveyed to Morning Star number 88 in 1887 by J.W. Moore. In 1933, Morning Star number 88 of the Order of Moses legally became incorporated in Montgomery County. The specific objectives of Morning Star 88 were the maintenance and education of orphan children of deceased members, the burial of the dead, and the care and oversight of the sick and destitute members. All of the heads all of the heads of Gibson Grove's community belonged to Morning Star number 88 Order of Moses. The men and the women, as well as children, all participated in the organization. Like many benevolent societies, the organization not only provided a safety net and economic security to its members, but it also increased civic participation and promoted educational programs. The actual image that you see before you is the original seal from the Morning Star Lodge number 88. So it was, the seal was actually sent over to members and friends of Moses, and we replicated the seal so that you could actually see it clearly in a new digital form outside of the just traditional stamp that would be used for official paperwork. In 1911, the school moved from its log cabin in Gibson Grove, AME Zion Church, when the county school board moved from the log cabin to Gibson Grove Church when the county school board decided to rent the space from the church. Each year, the local Morning Star number 88 Lodge would approve the rental. The church would serve as Cabin John School until 1922, at which point the school was closed due to low attendance. In addition to the Morning Star Tabernacle 88, the members of Morning Star also had contact with White's Tabernacle 39. It was based in the Tinleytown area of Northwest Washington, D.C., and located only 6.5 miles along River Road, just south, of Seven Locks Road and Cabin John. In fact, there was some overlap between the two lodges. Charles Brown of the Gibson Grove community was a trustee of White's number 39, and George Fry of Gibson Grove was also a White's number 39 member as well. Both were buried in White's Moses Cemetery on River Road in Bethesda. Due to the efforts of the Friends of Moses Hall, more than 80 probable burials at the Morning Star Tabernacle number 88 Moses Cemetery have been identified through newspapers, death notices, state or the DC death records, and or deceased family laurels. The burials date from 1884 to 1977. So racial injustice. Keeping in mind, racial injustice took place from the very beginning of, or in the inception of this community, in the fact that the African American community was only allowed to purchase certain plots of land, and many of their neighbors had clauses which wouldn't allow anyone to sell property to anybody who was African American. This plight kind of continues and goes further. And we see another case of it on a government level in 1937. So in 1937, the US government authorized the investment and construction of the David W. Taylor Ship Model Basin on land just north of Cabin John in West Bethesda. In the spring of 1939, the Navy ordered construction for homes of its workers and also purchased the former Cabin John Bridge Hotel site south of Conduit Road for its 100 white workers to become Cabin John Gardens. It also purchased the former Charles Brown homestead in Gibson Grove to create the Carver Road project off of 7 Locks, which would be housing for 20 Black workers. The property, bought from the heir, Lena Brown, was about 4.5 acres. It ended up housing a small half circle of modest bungalows for the basin's Black workers. But the roots of the purchase and the subsequent demolition were marked with accusations of racism. Failure to pay Brown's taxes meant the property was sold by the county and subsequently bought by Lily Stone, who was a large landowner in the area. Brown sued Stone for the property in 1940. They came to a resolution, and Brown sold the property to the government for $4,500. Yet, according to an article in 1941 in the Baltimore African American newspaper, hints in Brown's own oral history in 1976 state that her home and her belongings were burned by the government's building contractors before she could even move out. The local NAACP even became involved in this case. We see another case of racial discrimination from the government in the construction of the Capitol Beltway that took place in the early 1960s. The Beltway construction divided the Gibson Grove Church and Gibson Grove family plots from the rest of the Gibson Grove community in Cabin Johns Township. The right-of-ways for the highway construction was granted by Edward Jones, whose property bordered Moses Hall and Morning Star number 88 itself. It also prompted the Joneses to grant to Morning Star 88 a small slip of land which allowed access to the hall on the cemetery from 7 Locks Road. A few years later, senseless damage occurred when in the 60s, a local white youth reportedly burned down Moses Hall while intoxicated. The building was completely destroyed with only portions of the foundation still left, and those portions we see to this day. The Gibson Grove Church celebrated its 100-year anniversary and was designated on Montgomery County's Master Plan for Historical Preservation in 1998. Membership declined, and the Gibson Grove Amy Zion Church closed in 2002. First Agape AME Zion Church took over the property from the former Gibson Grove AME Zion Church. Past members of Gibson Grove decided to join First Agape as well in order to keep the church community still going. But tragedy struck when a fire burned the church on Ash Wednesday in 2004, destroying the interior, but not the exterior completely. Subsequent damage has happened with a tree falling on the church as well, extending the damage. One of the things that I would like to report is that even though a lot of these accounts are history, at the same time, we're also actively changing this history and having good news. So currently, we've just been notified that the church was able to obtain the final stages for a construction permit to stabilize the church. So the church is in the process of being rebuilt, and the stabilization should take place in the next coming months. However, it is this fire that became the introduction of me into the story of Gibson Grove. So the archaeology. With the fire, the church had to, based on oral reports that there were burials on the property, had to obtain an archaeological clearing. Someone had to come in and basically exhume the burials that were buried on the property, and per descendants' request, repatriate them into the Morning Star Tabernacle 88 Moses Cemetery. I came in, I talked with Reverend Bankhead and his wife, Judy Bankhead, obtained all of the information, the documentation that they had on the property. In addition to that, I was instructed and guided to living descendants of the Gibson Grove community, whereupon I talked with them, obtained permission from them, who were direct descendants of those buried on the property, to ensure that I could do this work. I secured permission from the state of Maryland, allowing for bodies to be exhumed and repatriated. An institution in Maryland agreed to house the remains for up to 6 months and would allow us unlimited access until the remains could be repatriated into the cemetery. And I obtained complete funding from the University of California, Berkeley, to do the excavations. So for me, it was making sure this project, since the church didn't actually have money for, at the time, archaeological excavations and work to be done, I made it a point to go out and make sure that all of the excavations were completely funded. So everything that I did was free of charge for the church. A week before I was supposed to conduct the excavations, I toured Morning Star Tabernacle 88 Moses Hall Cemetery. Upon touring that cemetery, it became obvious that I would have to go through and do an analysis and assess how many people were buried in this cemetery before I could actually do the excavations and the work on the church property. And in order to do that, I had to actually clear the cemetery. In order, at the time, the cemetery was overrun with bamboo. It had a lot of, it was the beginning of spring. So with every spring, everything is in full bloom. But I had to actually cut down all of the foliage in order to see the gravestone markers and the gravestones. I didn't do this alone. I was blessed to not only have my family come out, but my friends, local archaeologists from the ASM assisted in this, Montgomery County volunteers, members of the Cabin John community, as well as descendants, all came out to help me clear the cemetery in order for me to actually identify. With that community cleaning day of the cemetery that was done back in 2008, we went from a county record that said there were 7 people to being able to identify over 20 people. In the process of doing this, I actually learned the history of the Order of Moses, which I had not known before going into this. In addition to this, extensive research was done via mapping as well as sampling and surveying of the property. And what we identified was, in fact, the burials were, and the people were buried on the property. However, the church property had been sold several years earlier and actually separated. So, what came out of the investigation was the burials that had been on the church property were associated with the old log cabin structure, which actually is on property that is currently developed and has homes on it now. So the church was actually able to be cleared. I did do an extensive survey of the land just to double check that there was nothing there. So upon conclusion of my work, I was able to write a letter and essentially give the church clearance that no cultural resources would be disturbed upon the restoration and the restoring of the church structure. I was satisfied with my work. I thought that was the end of my journey with the Gibson Grove community and with exploring. However, with the work that I did, I actually did extensive anthropological work that never actually went into my dissertation. These were the interviews that I conducted with the descendants. This was work that I had accumulated over the years to just gain more information into the community that I had been holding for a number of years. But to my knowledge, outside of my dissertation, there was nothing more needed. So I thought that was the end of the work with Gibson Grove. Well, enter 2020. 2020 has been an interesting year for most of us, to say the least. And with that came the Friends of Moses Hall. McGuire stated, if you recognize the past we study are the past of the living communities, then we must also recognize an obligation to serve the interests of these communities. The history of Cabin John that I uncovered told the story of the African American community. The people that I interviewed years earlier were children that grew up in Gibson Grove, and this was their story that was being told. In 2020, the Friends of Moses Hall was organized with the purpose of saving Morning Star Tabernacle number 88 Moses Hall and Cemetery from destruction by I-495 expansion. The Friends of Moses Hall aims to preserve the site as a hallowed final resting place and an important African American historical site. The group is made up of descendants, preservationists, researchers, community members, and an archaeologist. This powerhouse group has come together to join forces to preserve the sacred space from the destruction posed by the expansion of I-495 that already did massive damage in 1960. One of the things that I want to note is that when 495 was built in 1960, there were all types of issues, environmental issues that have resulted from that. So if you are to ever drive down Seven Locks Road and go and look at the actual Gibson Grove historic structure for the AME Church, what you'll see is a lot of erosion. The drain off from the 495 from when it rains has been eroding the hill, which is directly adjacent to the church and causing problems with sloping. In addition to that, we've seen erosion on the side by the cemetery. Beyond that, just as recent as a few weeks ago, there was a car accident on 495, and because the gate that borders the cemetery and 495 is directly abutting the cemetery, a car actually came through and knocked over the gate into the cemetery. So you can just imagine some of the issues that we're having when it relates to expanding 495, considering how much damage it has already done to this historic community. Noted archaeologist Ferguson states, collaboration and practice exist on a continuum from merely communicating research to descendant communities to a genuine synergy where the contributions of the community members and scholars create a positive result. that could not be achieved without joining efforts. Collaboration then is not a uniform ideal or a practice, but a range of strategies that seek to link the archaeological enterprise with different publics by working together. My initial work was the initial step into what has blossomed into an extraordinary story of resilience of a community. Much of the history you've heard today has been updated and completed by the Friends of Moses Hall. So to just give you an idea, we have come together and all of the research, all of the ethnographic interviews, all of the independent research that everybody has done, we've actually pulled together. And we have like a huge drive of which we all do deep dives, and every day one of us is searching or looking for new information or has new questions or questioning a new person. And all of this is to create this synergy where different ideas and different strategies about how do we save this sacred space, how do we save this area that we all now call community from the extinction of 495. And I brought this picture up again just so you can have a visualization of how close this is to these two historic properties and what the expansion would mean for this larger community that has been silenced for so long. Since the start of the group, the cemetery has been brought back under the control of the Board of Trustees of Morning Star Tabernacle number 88. The cemetery is in the beginning stages of being restored. We have discovered artifacts associated with the lodge that were held in family possessions. And we have come upon some of the names. I apologize, I'm not quite sure. Oh. We have come upon some of the names for those buried in the cemetery and are actively crowdsourcing information from the public on possible additional information on those buried at the cemetery or a member of the Morning Star Tabernacle number 88 Order of Moses. So I wanted to give you an idea of these are all of the names that we have to date for those buried at the cemetery. And like I mentioned, we are actively crowdsourcing. This has become a community project, one that we're very proud of and one that we're very excited about. So if you do have information that you would like to share about a family member or someone that you know that may potentially be buried at Morning Star, please feel free to contact us via the Morning Star Moses cj@gmail.com email. And in closing, I would like to acknowledge and thank First Agape AME Zion Church and the Friends of Moses. These are the two current groups that make up what I would call the current Gibson Grove community. These are the community of people who are the activists who are actively working to save this sacred space and this landscape from destruction.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Jones. We are going to take some questions. Please, if you have questions for Dr. Jones, use the Q&A and send them to me, and then I'll read them out. The first question is from Robert. He writes, were members of the Gibson Grove community themselves or descended from people enslaved in Montgomery County? And is it known where? I believe you mentioned the Moore family. Were they enslavers in the county?
Okay. So we do know that, so it's a variety. The community came, so Sarah and Robert Gibson were enslaved in Virginia and came up from Virginia and moved into the area. We do have documentation that some of the members of Gibson Grove were enslaved by the Moore family. And there is story of being enslaved by the Stones. However, we don't know extensively and haven't done all of the information.
This question comes in anonymously. This person writes, how can members of the general public help with these projects?
If you'd like to help, you can actually send an email to the Moses Hall, the Gmail that I just placed up. You can send an email to that. And like I said, there's a big group of us who are working together in order to do this work. And there's any number of ways that you can get active.
I will go ahead and type that. I took a screenshot of that. I can put the Gmail in the chat for everybody. I actually have a question. So I am a volunteer. I am working with one of the artifacts that you mentioned, the ledger of number 88. I'm curious what other artifacts have been uncovered and collected from community members.
So we currently have part of the regalia. So as part of the Order of Moses, when they go through various rituals within the order, there was regalia that you would order, and one of the pieces was a sword. So we actually have a community member who has a sword, and when you open it, it actually says the Order of Moses on it, and it's very beautiful. In addition to that, the Gibson Grove, it's a history book that one of the descendants for the Gibson Grove AME Zion Church. So currently the Bankheads actually have a copy of that, that book, and it has documents and pictures and everything also chronicling the history of Gibson Grove AME. We also have a number of little small artifacts from the hall as well as the actual seal that they use to stamp official documentation.
That's incredible. Okay, so David writes, you said you found 20 graves. Was that on church property? Do you know how many total burials there are in the cemetery?
Yes, so the graves were not on the church property. The graves were in the Morning Star Tabernacle 88 Order of Moses Cemetery. So at the time, I hadn't cleared out a full area. So the amount of work that it would have done was way beyond a day's worth of clearing. But just in that time period, I was able to find all of the markers. And how I was able to come up with 20 was through the ethnographic studies that I did with the descendant members. I actually sat down and they gave me names of people who are actually buried there. So if you want to review those interviews, you can go directly to the Montgomery County Historical Society, and the transcriptions of all of those interviews conducted are there. And yes, there are more burials. We have since come up with just over 80 names, and we're still looking for more for the cemetery as well.
Okay. This question is from Michael. He writes, could you talk more about the role and purpose of a benevolent society like Morning Star number 88?
Yes, so benevolent societies were a super important part of African American life. Essentially, what you're looking at is a whole group of people who weren't afforded the basic privileges of every other American. And benevolent societies operated in a number of different ways. They acted as insurance companies. They acted as medical insurance. They were a community of people who were able to take care of each other and look out for each other. So what would happen is people would pay into a benevolent society, and you instantly became a member of this group and this organization that not only kind of camaraderie, but a unit that you knew would look after for you and take after you if anything was to happen to you or to your family. So it was kind of a larger act of resistance to the larger kind of what was going on in the US at the time. And the reason that you start to see these dissipating is more towards the 60s. And this is because the Civil Rights Act comes about. Insurance companies start realizing the power of the Black dollar and start providing more access for African Americans to this. So the need of benevolent societies aren't as important, but you can look back to early writings of W.E. Du Bois, and he does extensive studies on talking about benevolent societies and the role in African American life, and that African Americans would belong to up as many as 2 or 3 of these benevolent societies.
Paula has a question about the specific location of the church and cemetery. She said she lives off Seven Locks Road near Democracy Boulevard. She can't picture the location. Is it near MacArthur Boulevard?
Oh, so Paula, if you're driving down Seven Locks Road, the easiest thing is the one thing that we're fighting against, 495. So if you drive down Seven Locks Road and you see the overpass where 495 is, if you're coming from River Road, just before you hit the 495 overpass, you'll actually see the church right there. You can't miss it. There's an actual gate around it right now to keep people from going, until they stabilize the church. But you'll see it just as soon as you're driving up to the overpass. Look right over to your side and you'll see it.
And could you talk more about the plans to restore the church and the property?
So right now, the church is going through a process where they were getting permitting because they have to stabilize the property, the church foundation first, before they can actually rebuild the interior and the exterior structure. So that was just approved. So they'll be going through that process of stabilization. In addition to it, the church plans on expanding, so working to shore up where that erosion is happening from 495. They're going to have to do extensive work on the side of the church as well in order to take care of that. As far as the cemetery, it's I'm sorry. As far as the cemetery, we're currently working with preservationists to go through different preservation activities in order to upgrade the cemetery as well. So the bamboo that has been growing is currently being taken care of. We're working with the state to get the fence fixed where the car kind of ran into the cemetery as well. So there are a number of things that are taking place as well as actually going through the process of completing and making a fuller history of the background of the cemetery as well.
This is a question from David about contact info. Is the Morningstar Cabin John Gmail, is that the best way to reach you directly? Do you have a website? Do you compile your work where people are able to access it?
So as far as contact about information from Morningstar, yes, this is the best email, and it'll come to the Friends of Moses. So one of the things is, depending on what your question is, the question's directed to the person in the group that most accurately can answer your question.
Okay. Having read your dissertation, I am curious if you have plans to take the transcribed interviews that the Historical Society has and compile them in any way. Is there any kind of future project for you?
So for me directly, no. We actually have somebody who is a phenomenal researcher, and she has been creating what I feel like is about to be the book. All of the information that we seek out and find, she has been compiling into a manuscript that's unpublished currently. But we're pretty sure that it's going to turn into the book about the community.
Any idea when that's going to come out?
I don't want to speak for her, but we're going to push that in the next 2 years it should come out. We've already put out soft feelers. So
this question is from Michael. Michael asks, do the ethnographic studies and interviews include any family stories about the immediate post-emancipation years, Civil War, or earlier, or is everything from the founding of the community forward?
So everything is from the founding community forward, keeping in mind the people that I interviewed, many of them actually passed now, were children for most of this. So most of their recollection is from just their experiences living in Gibson Grove, as well as what they can remember from their parents. So most of it is kind of from the founding of the community forward.
Let's see. This looks like kind of a general comment. So Charlotte writes, Friends of Moses are in the process of setting up a website and it should be live within the next couple of weeks, just for general information. And then it looks like if anybody has any other questions, you can go ahead and put those in there. But if not, thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for that presentation. And thank you, Dawn, for the introduction. That was incredible. And it's being recorded. So if anybody wants to go back and watch it again, that should be available a little bit later. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.
Mm.